Esther, chapter 8. Let's dig right in. How about that? We've been moving way too slow with Esther, so let's start right away. Esther chapter 8 today, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2 to start out with. Esther chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Deborah is ready for that.
That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off a signet ring which he had claimed from Haman and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's.
Okay, thank you. That same day, we need to review a bit for that same day. Really, let's talk about the night before. Two key things happened the night before this particular day that we're still talking about in chapter 8. One thing that happened the night before was Haman came home from the banquet with the king and the queen, and he was over the moon because my life is wonderful in every possible way. Even the queen likes me, except for one fly in the ointment, which was Mordecai would not fear or tremble before me. And so his wife and his friends suggested, hey, have Mordecai executed in the morning and then go to your banquet in peace. No problem. So that was the night before. Haman decides to erect this execution device, probably a tall impaling pole for Mordecai. The other thing that happened the night before this same day, from chapter 8, verse 1, the other thing that happened the night before was that the king couldn't sleep, and so in his case of insomnia, he had his own records of his own accomplishments read to him, which is a great way to put you to sleep. And he found out that he had not honored Mordecai for saving his life. And so those are the things that happened the night before. So in the morning then, you have Haman seeking permission to kill Mordecai, and you have the king in need of an advisor because he can't make any decisions on his own. He needs an advisor to tell him what to do for the man he delights to honor. And lo and behold, that brings both the king and Haman into the same space. And they're both thinking about the same guy, but they don't know it. And the king says, what should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And of course, Haman's assumption is that the king is talking about who? Yeah, it must be me, right? So he gives this elaborate description of a fancy parade that should be given for the most wonderful man in the world. And the king says, great, go do that for Mordecai. So the first thing that happened on that same day is the great parade to honor Mordecai. And of course, Haman comes home humiliated. And now his family suddenly changes their tune and says, well, if this guy's Jewish, you're going to fall. There's nothing you can do to stand in his presence. And so that's what happened on that day. Then Haman was whisked away to banquet number 2 in the presence of Esther and the king. And that's where Esther reveals her petition and her request for her own life and the life of her people, because that vile Haman has done this terrible decree. At which point the king was angry and stormed out of the room, and Haman fell down and begged at Esther's couch, which when the king came back in looked an awful lot like sexual assault. And so Haman was whisked away and he was executed. That turned out to be his last meal. So that same day is the honoring of Mordecai and the banquet in which Haman is outed by Esther, and Haman is therefore executed for apparently coming on to the queen, which he was not doing, but it doesn't matter at this point. If the king is angry, the king is angry. So that same day, it's been a day of reversal. It's been a day of things flipping. It's been a day of justice, if you will. And that same day, we're going to have more reversal coming. It should be said, by the way, that from a biblical perspective, we are looking forward to a day of reversal, a day of justice, a day when God sets all things right, when Jesus comes again and makes everything the way it ought to be. And so this day, in some sense, anticipates that day that is yet to come. Questions about that same day before we move forward here? It was fun. It's been fun to read it. It gets more fun here even yet, or continues the fun. Yes, what did you say?
Is this, by the biblical research you're talking about, sort of like an Aesop's fable? Do we think it's more a moral story versus a credited real thing?
Right, that's the question really when we deal with Esther, is how historical is this? And you basically have two camps, at least the scholars that I'm working with. The one is that yes, it's a story just told to be a story. and there is not much historical basis, and they have reasons for saying that. And then others are like, well, this is really more of a based on a true story movie that's definitely been embellished for fun. Certainly, there's an awful lot of things that are polished in such a way as to make it good storytelling. Yeah.
Like the buffoonery of both the king and Haman.
Right. So there's some problems both ways. Most of the alleged historical problems, I think, are not really that big of a deal from my standpoint, and we'll get to another one of those today. But for me, the biggest thing is if we're basing a feast that we're going to have year after year to celebrate what the Lord did, and the Lord didn't actually do it, then it becomes kind of hollow. So I like to think there's a historical series of events that happened here, but clearly the storyteller is having fun telling this story in a very taking liberties type of way. And all of us have seen movies where we know the real sequence of events, and then we've seen the movie and we know some liberties were taken, but sometimes the liberties taken actually heighten the realities of the story, and so that becomes part of it. But even before movies, I mean, Paul Revere's Ride, the poem, takes some liberties with the historic sequence of events, and yet it is true to the spirit of what happened, in some sense. So I like to think of Esther as fitting in that kind of way. A movie that Liz and I like is Amazing Grace, which is about William Wilberforce and the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. And that definitely takes some liberties as far as what happened and does some poetic things to be fun or to be fitting. But it's not unfair to the reality that happened. It's a good way of telling the story. And so I like to think of Esther in that camp, although an awful lot of the scholars are of the camp that you suggested, where this is a story that's been written for a purpose by someone who meant well but didn't have the historical details in line. But I really don't think the objections to the historicity are that strong. In fact, there's a lot of things to this story that we know fit that era really well. I mean, there's some details there's some research that's been done here. If it was a made-up story, it at least fits the context very well. So, but I tend to be on the side of the aisle that says this is probably a based on a true story type of thing. But it's a little bit grayer with Esther than some other things. That's not, our whole faith doesn't hinge on that. I mean, Jesus tells parables that didn't actually happen. I mean, he actually told them, but the event didn't actually happen. And that doesn't change the fact that he's using them to teach us something important. So it doesn't all hinge on that. But there's nobody who views this as journalistic play-by-play in the 21st century sense of the terms. So, yes, Bill.
But in looking at that, if we look at what archaeologists find, and they go back in history of multiple different nations, and they take the writings of those things, those people aren't going to they're going to embellish the stories of their kings.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And we take those as historical facts.
Sure.
I'm not sure that we can take the Bible as any less of a historical fact than all of the writings of Egypt and Mesopotamia and all those other places.
Well, to be fair, with all ancient literature, you're always making judgment calls as to how historical this was or was not. And across the board in the ancient world, I mean, history is always written by the winners, and you always want to make your heroes look good. So one of the problems you have with Esther, as far as your question, Norm, the historicity of Esther, is that there's a lot of stuff in the book of Esther that's just not confirmed in other records of the era. Well, why would that be? Well, Xerxes looks like a moron, and so if you have any interest at all in making your king look good, you're going to leave out his worst moment. And then you're also going to allow for the fact, I think, that your storyteller in this case does not have an interest in making a pagan king look good. He has an interest in making the faithful Jews look faithful, and so that's part of it too. But you're always trying to make decisions with ancient texts. How do we understand this? And then the other thing about ancient people is we have to let ancient people be ancient people. They did not get their primer on 20th and 21st century standards for history, journalism, science, whatever. And so, and especially in the case of the Bible, the Lord's not scandalized by that. He's not like, I got to really catch these people up so they can communicate to these 21st century people in Indiana. We have to do the hard work of figuring out how they thought and how they viewed the world, and acceptable ways of writing literature. You and I, we all have acceptable ways of talking. We don't scrutinize our own conversations every day for, was that literally historically true? If I said that somebody was driving me up the wall, you don't actually picture me riding in a car going up a wall, but we understand that's a true state. We talk this way all the time. The Pacers destroyed the Knicks, and they both play the next night. I mean, it's not really destruction. We do this all the time. So yeah, but to get to the base of the question, that is a debate with Esther. How do we understand this? And then basically the scholars that I'm reading, the 8 sources I'm reading, are about evenly split on that. But I would say overall scholarship probably leans to what you're suggesting, that overall scholarship says this is probably a story. And then there's a minority of the scholars that say, well, this could well be based on a historical core of events that happened. But it's obviously written in different places in a very buffoonish, cartoonish, exaggeration type of thing. Some of the numbers are stretched. And that doesn't really, we allow for the fact that there's different kinds of literature in this beautiful book, and we can be okay with that. It doesn't really rattle us. But one good point that I thought that Bill had tucked into that comment is that sometimes we give more benefit of the doubt to like one record from one historian as opposed to what the Bible is saying. So one issue in today's text is this idea, again, that the laws of the Persians couldn't be revoked. And the scholars will say, well, there's no evidence for that outside of the Bible, and yet both Esther and Daniel testify that reality multiple times. So that's kind of an argument from silence. Well, nobody else says anything about it, so it must not be true. Well, not necessarily. I mean, we don't have any other evidence. So part of that is, what do you give the benefit of the doubt to? Who do you automatically, give more weight to? But I'm inclined to think that there was an actual sequence of events here, and our storyteller is a very gifted storyteller. But that's just where I happen to be. And if you think differently, it's not the end of the world, hopefully. So that same day. So we've covered 3 words so far, 2 in the Hebrew. King Xerxes gives Queen Esther what in chapter 8, verse 1? His estate. Yeah, literally the house of Haman, which I think is more fun to say, the house of Haman. So all of his stuff goes to Esther. One thing, so I try to read as much as I can every week for you. I don't get to everything. But the last commentary I got to last night before I gave up pointed out that Haman was going to give great wealth to the king to bribe him to execute the Jews. And now the wealth of Haman is being given by the king to Esther. So another reversal there, another direction change in that. Haman, the enemy of the Jews, he's described that way a lot of different times in this book. He's the number one bad guy. When we get to our Feast of Purim and we actually read the whole thing, we'll get a flavor for how often he's called the enemy of the Jews. And so Mordecai comes before the king. We've had a lot of coming before the king or not coming before the king in the book of Esther. We had Vashti refusing to come before the king. We had Esther and Mordecai talking about the danger of coming before the king. We had Esther actually coming before the king. We had Haman coming before the king, seeking permission to kill Mordecai, but didn't quite get that far with the conversation. And now we have Mordecai coming into the presence of the king. And what new pieces of information is the king aware of now at the end of verse 1? What? Yes. So chapter 2, Mordecai had said, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish or that we're related. That was to be kept secret. And apparently this whole way along, at least as far as the upper level of the palace is concerned, that information has not been known. This explains in part why the king hadn't connected the dots, that the people group that Haman wanted to wipe out included his wife and the guy who saved his own life. So he hadn't made that connection because Esther had not spilled the beans on that. We do get the idea implied that some of the lower level eunuchs and servants who were involved in the communications between Esther and Mordecai and the preparations for her going to see the king, you get the idea they may have known something, but the king did not yet know of her ethnicity or her family connections. But now that the king knows that Mordecai is related to Esther, what's going to happen is going to happen. So verse 2, what does the king do for Mordecai? His signet ring. Who had previously been in possession of the signet ring? Haman. So now we're having this continued reversal of things here. It was probably a bad idea for the king of the largest empire on the face of the earth to be very cavalierly giving out his signet ring to anybody, but he's at least made a better choice here with Mordecai than with Haman. And so now signet ring means the authority to sign and document decrees on behalf of the king. So Mordecai has now become the right-hand man, basically, of King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. Yes.
Signet ring is the auto
The auto pen, that's right. That's right. It's like when you get a letter from somebody who's too busy to write their own letters. Like I would get these in high school. You make the honor roll, and you get a letter from the superintendent. The superintendent hasn't even looked at it, right? It's a form letter, and he's got a stamped signature, and you have a little initial of the secretary that actually did all the hard work, right? So signet ring is kind of like that, right? He's doing the, I congratulate you warmly for making the honor roll. I have no idea who you are. Anyway, signet ring, he's able to authorize all of these documents and things on the king's behalf. He effectively becomes prime minister, right-hand man, whatever you want to call it here, premier, over the empire. And what does Esther do to follow up with this? She gives the house of Haman to Mordecai. So Haman got Mordecai's execution, and Mordecai has gotten Haman's parade, and Haman's authority, and Haman's honor, and Haman's house. And so the complete reversal is continuing here in chapter 8. Yes, Jeff?
The theme is don't cause harm or try to cause harm to the chosen.
That's right. That's right. The theme here is God's chosen people will be vindicated by Him. That's certainly the theme here. The theme is also don't be an arrogant, anger-controlled, alcohol-controlled type of person. And that's happened with the king, really, but certainly with Haman. Be careful what you manufacture for somebody else. Haman is a perfect character for the book of Proverbs. All the types of people that Proverbs speaks against, Haman is that guy. He's the arrogant fool who's plotting the destruction of the innocent and plotting his own gain and seems to be getting away with everything, but he'll get what's coming to him. And this is the kind of guy, any movie, any book, the Haman figure is the one we want to lose, and he's going to lose again here. Other questions or comments about those first two verses, chapter 8? Yes, Todd.
I guess in a general observation, whatever, anytime personally that I see Jews referenced in righteousness and this and that and the other thing, I look at it through the lens of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So here's 6 million people, innocent people who were murdered.
Right.
And God's chosen people.
Sure.
Common.
Sure.
And certainly, Germany's flattened, destroyed as a nation.
Right.
Nazis, fascism, this, that, and the other.
Right.
Paper sheets and so on and so on.
Right.
Does not, in my book, does not even begin to compensate or ameliorate
Right.
or
Right.
6 million innocent deaths.
So Todd is talking about the Holocaust, Germany, Europe, World War II, and yes, Hitler died, and yes, the Nazis lost, but that doesn't quite take care of all of the injustices yet. Not everything has quite been righted. Now we're back to Norm's point about this seems to be resolving way too quickly to be real life, right? So in our case, we are looking to Resurrection Day when Jesus comes, and the way I read Isaiah, Jesus coming will be good news for everybody who really got desperately wrong in this reality. So the vindication for the Jews of the 1930s and 40s in Europe is yet to fully come, And we're thinking about that even. We have Christians around the world today that are being martyred for their faith, and we say, well, that's not right, and it's still not right. And some of them have been dead for years and are still waiting for the vindication. But the day will come. So the New Testament authors see the resurrection of Jesus Christ as being the clincher. The vindication day is coming, and that He's the one who will do all the sorting. And so we are still waiting. It rarely comes across as neatly and tidily as it has here in Esther. We might also note that at this point in Esther, it's a great point to bring up your observation there, because after verse 2, have we really settled things? What was Esther's petition and request in chapter 7? It was 2 parts. What did she want back in chapter 7? Well, let's go back and read it here. Chapter 7, verses 3 and 4 of chapter 7. Who wants to read that? Just go ahead and read it out loud that we have it. Esther 7, 3 and 4. You want that, Sandy?
Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request.
That'll work right there, right? So my petition, my request is my life and my people's life. And so far what we've gotten is the execution of Haman and the honoring and promoting of Mordecai. And Esther's still alive, but we haven't really dealt with the problem. We've not dealt with the core problem. So Liz and I were talking about this last night a bit. Why? Why has the king not yet addressed the core problem? The first and most likely possibility is the king is a little dense. We've picked up on that. We've picked up on that, right? He's not quite, maybe hypothetically you've heard of this, a husband didn't really listen to his wife. Like she said one thing and he heard something else. And if he's angry and drunk, that only makes it worse, right? And so that's probably the most likely explanation. There are two other related explanations that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. One is that for some reason the king is hesitant to deal with the core issue because he knows that he was involved in it. That's possible. It's also possible, and this will be the case here later, that because it was one of those irrevocable decrees of the kings of the Persians, he can't actually do that. So he's like doing the best that he can. Some combination of those things. Whatever the case, verse 2 ends, and we've had a great day of reversal, but we've not really dealt with the core problem, which is that Esther and Mordecai and all their people are still technically subject to die on this day, which is yet to come. And so the king has to be prodded again. So let's read verses 3 through 6 of chapter 8. Esther chapter 8, 3 through 6. The second row, Steve, over here to my right has it. Esther 8, verses 3 through 6.
Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?
Okay, thank you, Steve. So she again has a word with the king. It says pleaded in the NIV, but the word is word. And at the level of the Hebrew text, throughout Esther, we see whose word is being done. In chapter 5, when the king said, quick, get Haman, bring him here for this banquet, let's do the word of Esther, we have had things flip where it's actually Esther's word, Esther's will that's being done. So now Esther's word comes again to the king. She falls at his feet weeping. Who was the last person to fall at somebody's feet weeping in this book so far? Haman, right? And he fell at Esther's feet weeping. So now she is falling at the king's feet weeping, and she begs him to end the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he has devised against the Jews. We'll go back and read that plan in just a moment, because reading that in contrast to what happens here will be helpful for us in hearing the reversals here. But the king extends the gold scepter to Esther. This raises a question: how much gap is there between verse 2 and 3? Is this happening at the same time, like we're all in the same room and Mordecai has been honored and now Esther falls for the king? Or is she coming in again and needs the gold scepter extended again for permission to enter? And we really don't know for sure. It's one of those things where the author at this point isn't interested in stretching that kind of dynamic out again. The gold scepter could be extended again in the context of I'm begging, and this says, it seems to me when the king extends the gold scepter, it's a good thing. And when he doesn't, it's a bad thing, regardless of the setup. So whatever the case, she is obviously emotional about this, and she falls before him, and the gold scepter means you can stand up and talk. She uses the language again, verse 5. Notice this: if it pleases the king, or if it seems good to the king, if it regards me with favor. That pairing has happened before in her requesting, and she again keeps framing as if it's good to you and if I found favor, which we know she has. So she's putting herself in that humble position of persuading. Yes, Liz.
I'm told there's a question in the chat from Janet Brown that says, what happened to Haman's family after the estate was given to Esther?
What happened to Haman's family after the estate was given to Esther? The answer is stay tuned. Stay tuned. The author has not given that detail away yet. But the short answer is not good. In general, in the ancient world, if you anger the king, it's not only bad news for you, but everybody who's related to you. And so it will be bad news there as well. But what happened to Haman's family, that question will get landed here in another chapter, I think. Yes.
I'm struck by this instruction number 2,
Mm-hmm.
going out to satraps, governors, and nobles.
Yeah.
Can you imagine, you get the message from Haman, and then a short time later, you get this next message through Mordecai, from
Right.
the same king,
Right.
the same ring,
Right. Right.
and you're going,
Right.
what are we to do?
Right. So Norm has read to the end of the chapter here, and he's thinking there's a little administrative whiplash for all these folks across the empire who are supposed to prepare the people to carry out decree number 1, and now they get decree number 2, which is going in the opposite direction. And it's the same king, the same ring. Well, the answer is it's really a different person doing the writing here. The king has given his ring to the other side now. So, yeah, but definitely this king.
The receivers don't know that.
No, not off at the Indus River or the.
Decree and the ring.
Right, not at the Indus or the Nile. So, yeah.
Do you think though that the writers that went out maybe had some background information that they were passing to?
Yeah, we don't know. We do know, and this is one, back to your question from earlier, one of the evidences in favor of this being at least at its base an historical story is we know that the Persian Empire had a reputation for this kind of swift and organized communication, that the king doesn't look that great, but the administrative efficiency of getting the word out seems to have been pretty good in the Persian world. But what happens to Haman's house, we'll hang tight for another chapter on that, like as far as the people who lived in the house, literally. But Esther using language of pleasure and favor, if it seems good to the king, if I have favor, and if he thinks it's good, let an order be written really revoking the dispatches that Haman has devised. We know from chapter 1, at least we think we know from chapter 1, that an edict of the king cannot be revoked. The phrasing in chapter 1 could be as simple as an edict of the king can't be broken. In other words, you got to keep his laws. But later here in this chapter, and what we read from Daniel gets the idea, what we're trying to convey here is that an order of the king cannot actually be revoked. You can't pull it back. You're going to have to overrule it with another order, and the NIV translation is going ahead and taking that word overruling rather than just revoke. But we've got to pull back the dispatches that Haman had sent out, which we'll read here in just a moment. They were devised to destroy. That was the purpose of what Haman did, destroy the Jews throughout all the king's provinces. And then in verse 6, we get the heart of Esther. How can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? When we're aware of human suffering in general, that's hard enough. When it becomes our own family, our own people, then that really drives it up another notch. And so we get here the heart of Esther in a way we really haven't had before. In fact, we may have wondered if this level of Esther's heart existed back in chapter 4, when we're having that back and forth between Mordecai and Esther through the messengers. And she's saying, well, don't you know that if I go before the king unannounced, I get killed? And she's going through her excuses and things. And that's when Mordecai is like, hey, if you don't become the source of deliverance, it'll come from someplace. And if you don't, you're going to die anyway. So we find out that Esther is more than just pragmatic. She does have a heart for her people, especially now that apparently all this good stuff has happened to her and to Mordecai personally, and she is still deeply distraught about the reality. So she is not satisfied at the end of verse 2 until something is done for her people throughout the empire, which is her plea there in verses 5 and 6. Let's go back and read that original decree that went out because of what Haman said. So chapter 3, I'm not going to read the whole of chapter 3. You're familiar with the setup, that Haman, for reasons unspoken, becomes the vizier, the premier, the prime minister, whatever you want to call him, and everybody has to bow down before him and honor him, and Mordecai won't, either for theological reasons or ethnic reasons or personal reasons or possibly all of those. Mordecai won't honor Haman. So that's when Haman gets angry and decides not just to wipe out Mordecai, but his whole people from the whole empire. He indicates to the king, it's not worth your while to let these people live. It's not in your best interest to let them live. And so he makes this decree with the king's permission without the king realizing that he's talking about the Jews or that his queen and the guy who saved his life are a part of this target group. But I want to focus in on the actual going out of the edict and this will get to the administrative whiplash that Norm was talking about. Esther chapter 3, let's read verses 12 through 15. This is the actual dispatching of the decree from Haman, with the king's ring and everything. Esther chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. Who would like that? John has it. Thank you.
Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province, and in the language of each people, all Haman's orders to the kings, satraps, governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various people. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day. The 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out. An edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was to be willing.
Okay, thank you, John. So that in Esther 3, 12 through 15 is the original going out of Haman's decree. And there's several things I'll highlight because they're going to contrast directly with or they're going to be repeated directly in the second decree that goes out. 13th day of the first month is when the secretaries are summoned. The new decree is going to go out on the 23rd day of the third month, which means 70 days later. And because we read the book of Revelation, we're like, ooh, 70. That sounds like a number of completeness or fullness or whatever. So we've deliberately rounded things here probably. It communicates something significant. 70 days, and here we are. We're going to have this addressed. Secretaries are summoned in the script of each province, and the language of each people. So the preservation of a script or of a language of a people is a preservation of their identity and their dignity. And we know that the Persians at this point kind of prided themselves on allowing some of these nations they conquered to maintain some sense of national identity, as long as you don't upset the apple cart and you send the money into the treasury, all this kind of stuff. Well, we're going to have that emphasized again in the second decree, but we're going to add the emphasis on the Jews. It's going to go out in Hebrew as well and to the Jewish people as well. So their dignity and identity is preserved through this. It goes out to all the kings, satraps, governors, and nobles, as Norm has noted. In the name of King Xerxes, sealed with his ring. That's going to be the same case as the second one that goes out. Dispatches sent by couriers to all the king's provinces. We talked about their mail system. To destroy, kill, and annihilate. Those three words have been repeated multiple times to describe what Haman wants to have happen. Jews, young and old, women and little children. And keep that in mind for a moment. That's the target group. Not just the men, but the women and the children, all Jews in the target group. On a single day, 13th day of the 12th month. We're not sure why the 13th day, but the 12th month was what Haman had cast the pur. Purim comes from pur. He had cast the pur to determine that month and to plunder them as well. And then the couriers are spurred on by the king's command, and the edict is issued in Susa. The king and Haman drink, and the city of Susa is perplexed, confused, bewildered. That was decree number 1. Questions before we look at decree number 2 here? Yes, Bill?
You have to wonder if a lot of dispersed people, all of a sudden, they come out against the Jews like this. Could we be next?
Sure, yes.
Right. They're going to destroy the Jews. We're a subgroup inside the thing. Could we be next to be destroyed?
So Bill was raising a great question, which I think the text intends to raise there at the end of chapter 3. The last thing we read in chapter 3 is this perplexion or this confusion or this stirring in the city of Susa, which implies that there wasn't this majority of people that hated the Jews at that time in the empire. We know that it was a very diverse empire, lots of different people groups. And so part of Bill's question here, I think it's a fair one, is, well, what about what about our group? We read the Jews are going to get knocked off. Why? What did they do? And could we be next? And I think it's fair to assume that that kind of thinking was happening in the empire, because near as we can tell, this would appear unprovoked. The city of Susa was not expecting a decree to wipe out the Jews in the whole empire. And people have got to be wondering, especially since the king tends to be a little, I'll say, trigger happy on some of his decisions, that maybe we should be a little apprehensive about this progression. So sure, absolutely, I think that is in mind. I wanted to go back again here, though. Esther's genuine distress at the hardship coming upon her family. We tend to be very individualistic as Americans, and we tend to be that way as Christians in America too. And tonight, Liz is mentioning, this compassion child in the Philippines, but we have a family of faith around the world where a lot of suffering and hardship is happening. So this is one reason that we have a day. For example, we pray for the persecuted church particularly, and we pray for them in general. Like, disaster is falling on our people, so to speak. Actually, literally, it's falling on our people around the world, and that kind of thing is still happening. So Esther has this ability to think outside of herself with genuine compassion when contrasted with Haman and the king, who tend to think only about themselves. And so that the heart of Esther is being poured out here as well. I have a people that are hurting. It's not just about me. Let's see. How far did we read? Verses 7 and 8. How about that? Back to chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. Normal, have it. Thank you.
King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked.
Okay, so that last comment, no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked, is kind of a way of explaining to Esther why he had not yet done something, and yet also his way of explaining the authority that is just given to Mordecai and Esther by saying, if you take my ring and my seal, then you'll be good. Yes, Norm.
I marvel at how American government is duplicated that.
Yeah, yeah,
You think of the number of times that they revoke something.
yeah.
Prohibition is the one that I can think of that it was totally revoked.
Yeah, yeah.
But otherwise, you stack on another law that supersedes
Yeah, that's right.
this law and put it in chapter 55,
Yeah, so-
paragraph 33.
That's right, that's right.
Volume 28.
Right. Norm is saying that even in our environment, we're not very good at revoking laws. We're just good at writing more laws to clarify or perhaps muddle preceding laws, and we just write more and more and
Instead
more.
of one king, we make 100 senators and 435 representatives.
Right. We got
The ones that does it.
we got a lot of kings, and then the other thing that happens too, and this is where I thought you were going with that, is there's an awful lot of things that become law that the person who actually ends up, or the group of people actually end up authorizing it, they don't care that much about. It's somebody's little pork barrel thing that rises to the top and it becomes law because it has the right vote and the right signatures on it. Liz, you had a comment? No? Okay. So Xerxes replies, because Haman attacked the Jews, I gave his house to Esther, and they killed him. Okay, well, that's great, but that hasn't quite taken care of the problem. But he says now, so notice how he says it. I gave the house to Esther, they killed Haman. Like he still distances himself from his own responsibility in everything. This is part of the genius. We missed this. I skipped over it. The genius of Esther, when Esther blamed the decree on Haman and not the king. The king was totally complicit in the whole thing. When she had this second round of conversation with him in chapter 8, she manages to leave out the fact that the king is just as responsible as Haman is for the thing. She's very clever in her way of describing stuff. But this is the way the king thinks. In the king's mind, the king has no responsibility for any bad thing that ever happens to anybody. Right? If you're mourning, stay out of the palace. I don't want to hear about it. And so the king says, I have given his house to Esther, and they have killed him, with my approval, mind you, but with my command. But, now you write another decree, and the you is plural in verse 8 of chapter 8. The you is plural, you meaning Mordecai and Esther. You have joint authority to develop this legislation, and because I've given Mordecai the signet ring, he can seal it with my authority, and it'll go out with just as good of authority as the previous decree that is going out. As seems best to you is literally as is good in your eyes. Now, all of us who've read the book of Judges immediately has our alarm bells going off because, oh my goodness, doing what's good in our own eyes is bad news. Just read the book of Judges. But in this case, we have the good guys that we trust, Mordecai and Esther, and they're the ones that are going to be doing what is good in their eyes. And that's going to go out with the king's authority, which cannot be revoked. And as one of the commentaries said I was reading last night, this is not going to be an exercise in creative writing. This is going to be line for line, word for word, point for point, rebuttal or overriding, as you're talking about, of the original decree that's going to happen here, beginning of verse 9.
And it does make note too that royal secretaries, it's multiple languages, this has to go out.
Yes, yes.
All the way to India.
Yes, yes. And we're going to emphasize that again here with the addition. So we just read a moment ago the decree that went out from Haman. And it says, as we would expect, this goes out to the Persian Empire in all the languages to all the people there. But here we're going to have added in, as we read verses 9 through the end of the chapter, we're going to have added in, and also to the Jews in their own language. The threat was the Jewish people are going to be wiped out. That's a problem because God has promised to bless all the nations through the offspring of these people. So if they're wiped out, that's bad news. So the danger was going to be wiped out. But if the people and their language, implied culture, identity, dignity, are preserved, then they will in fact survive. And so we're highlighting here, this is going out in all the languages, including Hebrew and to the Jews, and that'll be emphasized here.
I think
Also,
back
John.
to Moses and the Jews' position in Egypt
Mm-hmm.
was such that Egypt would probably have a lot of trouble operating if they wiped out the Jews.
Right.
So I wonder about this situation.
Yes, yes.
If they take this, the people that are getting the order are going, wait a minute, we won't have people serving us lunch, making our
Right. So that's a great observation, Norm. And Norm was talking about Egypt. When the reason Pharaoh was reticent to let the Hebrews go was because it's his labor, right? It's the free labor for the most powerful man in the world to keep his empire going. He had other people he was oppressing too, but that's why he doesn't want to let them go. And so there's some question. This is why Haman maybe offers the bribe to the king. I understand that if I deplete the population in your empire, that's an adverse thing for you, so how about lots of money? So that may be part of what's going on here. And Esther, again, to talk about the cleverness, the wisdom of Esther, in this second presentation to the king, not only does she not blame the king, but rather blames Haman for this decree that's gone out, she also mentions in verse 5 of chapter 8 that it was Haman who devised this decree to destroy the Jews in all the king's possessions, all the king's provinces. In other words, this is the king's turf, and Haman has presumed to take something away from the king's turf. So she's playing on exactly what you're saying, which is, these are people that belong to you, O king, and Haman devised the decree to destroy them. So she has very cleverly reminded the king that something is at stake for him in this issue, and so that's part of why he gives them permission to write whatever they think is best. Again, he doesn't want to do the hard thinking. You all do that, put my signature on it, it'll be good to go, and in triplicate send it out. Yeah, it'd be a tax issue. It'd be a labor issue. I mean, if you were to pick any one people group and remove them from any given country, you would know there'd be productivity. People are doing jobs you don't even think about, but if they disappear, you'd notice that they were gone. And so, yeah, it has an impact, a ripple effect. And these are the king's provinces, Esther is quick to point out. These are your provinces, O king, and your people and your empire that Haman wanted to get rid of. And so that's what allows this decree to go out. Any other questions, observations? It's a great conversation today. We're back in rhythm, going way slower than I anticipated, which is great. We've got it back here. Let's read verses 9 through 14. How about that? 9 to 14. And listen, keep in mind, just a few moments ago, we read the original decree that Haman wanted. So listen for the similarities and differences here. Who wants to read Esther 8, verses 9 through 14? Jamie, thank you.
So on June 25th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Mordecai decreed. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors, and the nobles of all the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. The king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. The day chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes was March 7th of the next year. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that the Jews would be ready to take revenge on their enemies on the appointed day. So urged on by the king's command, the messengers rode out swiftly on fast horses bred for the king's service. The same decree was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa.
Okay. Before we talk about the reaction in Susa, just a few things to highlight here again. 23rd day of the third month, literally. Jamie's translation tries to make it readable for us, but I don't want to miss the detail there. So this is 70 days after the first decree went out. The second decree is going out. Mordecai's word is going out to the Jews. So Mordecai's word is holding sway now. It becomes the king's word. To all the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces, that's the same target group as before, written in the script of each province and language, and notice also the add-on there, the end of verse 9, also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, so Mordecai now has Haman's former authority. And then the last part of verse 10 is a little bit unclear. Fast is our interpretation. These are horses that have been bred from the king's best horse. The last time the king's horse was involved in the book was when? Who rode the king's horse? Yeah, Mordecai got to ride one of the king's horses. And these are horses bred from the ultimate stud from the king's collection. So we're assuming that they are the fastest horses. That's implied again here a bit later. So the emphasis, this decree is going out even more swiftly than the previous one, to enhance the administrative whiplash that Norm has been talking about. It gives in verse 11 the Jews the right to assemble and protect themselves, and then a reversal of the three verbs that were used against the Jews: destroy, kill, and annihilate. So the Jews may assemble and protect, and they may destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force that comes against them and their women and children. Now, that phrase, them and their women and children, there's two different ways to take that as far as the Hebrew text is concerned. One would give the Jews permission to attack the women and children of those who might attack them. But I think the better way to take it is meaning them and their women and children, because back in chapter 3, we read this a moment ago, the target group for annihilation was the Jews and their women and children. And so this is now the right to attack anyone who might attack the Jews and their women and children. So I don't think at this point here we have the authorization to go out and knock off the women and children of the attackers. However, I could be wrong, and in the ancient world, justice was often conceived in a communal way. You think about Daniel in the lion's den, it's not just the guys who conspired against Daniel, but their wives and children who get the punishment. And spoiler alert, Haman's household gets punishment here as well coming up. So that could well be, and that's part of the messiness of a different culture that just is there. But I think in this case, the edict leans on defense and right to protect and defend yourself and to fight back if they attack you, which is going to discourage the attacks against them. They are no longer a soft target. They have authorization of the king to fight back. And notice the Jews are also given the right to plunder their enemies. This is something that happens in the Exodus and Egypt. The people are able to plunder the Egyptians. The Egyptians are so excited to see them go that they give them all kinds of great stuff. Here, have the family jewelry case. Just get out of here. And so they plundered the Egyptians, is the emphasis in Exodus. and they're going to have the right to plunder here as well. We'll see in a few verses whether or not they take advantage of that right. The day appointed is the same day, 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, which is the day that Haman had rolled the dice, rolled the pur to determine. And the Jews are going to be ready to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers go out fast. That's the emphasis of the swiftness of this going out by the king's command, just as they did before. And they're just as confused, Norm, as the satraps and the governors, the horseback riders. Wait, we just brought this out and it says something different, and now we got this. What's going on? And the edict is issued in the citadel of Susa. We got to land the plane briefly. We might go back and unpack this next week. The reaction to the first decree in Susa was what? How did the people react? They were shocked. They were bewildered. They were confused. I'm going to read this now, the last few verses of chapter 8, beginning at verse 15. Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. That's a lot different than the sackcloth, by the way, that he wore earlier. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. So the bewilderment is gone, and now there's relief, probably back to Bill's point. Hey, this is a good thing because we don't want random people groups being knocked off by the king. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. 4 happy words that replaced the 4 negative words they had before when they had the difficulty coming against them. In every province, in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, verse 17, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, feasting, literally drinking and celebrating, lots of drinking going on in Esther. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. The word there is a little bit uncertain. Either they became Jews or they said, I'm with the Jews. You know, whether actual conversion happens or not, that word only shows up once in the Old Testament, so we're a little bit fuzzy on that. But clearly they said, I'm with them. I'm with them now, and I'm full of joy. And fear of the Jews had seized them just as it had for Haman's wife and friends earlier on. If this guy's Jewish, you're in trouble, pal, was what they told him at the end of chapter 6. The reaction's very, very different now. The garments of Mordecai very, very different now. The first decree, he was mourning. The second decree, he's in royal robes, communicating his position of power and status. He even got Haman's clothes at the end of chapter 8. Even got his clothes. Questions or comments here as we reflect on chapter 8? Yes, Sandy.
Like how God prepared David to be a king by setting him around the whole, he had to run around the whole countryside and know what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems Xerxes just been protected in a palace and he's never been given.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So Sandy is saying prior to David becoming king, David had to go all over the place. A matter of survival for part of that time, right? But he got to know the area that he was ruling before he began to rule it. Contrast that with the king here, Ahasuerus Xerxes, who seems to be a guy who's forever in his palace and clueless about what's actually happening, in the world. And I think, the part that we mentioned earlier where if you're mourning, you can't even come into the king's compound. Can't even. If you're sad, stay out of here. He's just totally deaf-eared to anybody suffering anywhere, which may be why he has such an adverse reaction when Esther says, I need to point out to you this human suffering that's happening because of your decree, O king, which she manages to blame on Haman and not on him, actually. He's a pretty cloistered guy. Yes, Bill.
Well, you wonder with the people celebrating and everything, Haman apparently wasn't well liked within Susa.
Mm-hmm.
If he was not well liked across the rest of the kingdom,
Yeah.
and they knew that Haman was behind the first edict, they may have been happy to see Haman taken away and
Yeah.
done away with, and somebody else that they felt was more in favor of the people put in charge.
Right. I don't know how empire-wide Haman was known, and since all this stuff is going to the perimeter of the empire, just with the king's seal of signature, I don't know how much they knew. But to your point, in Susa, they do know Haman. And when the thing came up before, when Haman was falling down on Esther's couch, and the king says, who will assault the king? And it just happens to be one of the king's attendants there says, hey, I know of this great execution device we can kill him on. I mean, you get the idea that the people who did know Haman were very excited about getting rid of him. So how widely he was known, I don't know. But I know those who did know him didn't care for him.
But
Yeah.
the rulers and stuff and all those things had probably come in to the big party that
Now that's a good, yeah,
that
yeah.
he's had before.
Yeah, all of
He
the,
was probably
Right.
there.
Right.
So a lot of the higher officials would have known Haman.
right. So Haman's song, as we said, somebody said a few weeks ago, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect every way. To know me is to love me." That was Haman's view of himself. But actually, there were quite probably, as you're saying, a lot of people with Haman. To know him is to hate him. And you're pointing out that a lot of these satraps and governors and these sorts of officials who are receiving these whiplash messages from these horse riders were maybe in the town for that lengthy period of time honoring the king, and they may have gotten to know Haman. And what we the readers know of Haman is, if you got to know Haman, there's a good chance you don't like Haman. So yeah, there's definitely some bad vibes about him. But again, the way these decrees go out, neither Haman nor Mordecai are mentioned in the decrees themselves, even though they're the actual hands behind it. So how widely it is known that Haman is the one responsible for reading, I don't know. The first decree.
I still think the rumor mill
Yeah.
is enough.
Yeah. I don't know. But there is no love lost, I think, about Haman among different people in this story. Yes.
The story starts out with all the feasting and life was good. Everyone was talking about how great things were, and that this whole issue between Haman and Mordecai, there's probably a lot of people didn't know about because we just read where the people were bewildered whenever that.
Right.
They, the Jews seem to be getting along with everyone.
Right.
All of a sudden, here's
Right. You do get the idea from the end of chapter 3 that throughout the empire there was not a widespread disdain for the Jews, and there was no understanding of the inner drama between Haman and Mordecai throughout the empire. There's just this decree comes out with no explanation, time to kill the Jews 11 months from today. And what in the world are we doing this for? So there definitely is some bewilderment there. But anybody who knows Haman is going to not be sad that Haman gets what's coming to him. So Haman was promoted with no explanation. We are never given the reason why he was promoted. We're only given the reasons why he is deposed and disposed of in this book. Yeah. So Mordecai has gotten Haman's, first Haman got Mordecai's gallows or execution pole, the impalement probably, and then Mordecai has gotten Haman's honor, his clothing, his house, his position, his authority, all of this stuff that Haman was like, isn't my life wonderful because I have all these things, now have become the possession of Mordecai. And his life was going to get one more step wonderful if he could eliminate Mordecai, and he himself was eliminated. So the ironies are rich and thick and multi-layered here. Don't be like Haman is a good moral of the story. Yes, Todd.
Can we begin this, Mordecai refusing to bow down to Haman? And in chapter 3, verse 4, they spoke him day after day. So my question, whatever, Mordecai's not the only Jew in Susa.
Right.
Can't be.
Right.
Is he the only one refusing to bow down? Or as word circulates,
Right.
does Haman get the idea, boy, these Jews are causing problems?
Right. So is
going to cause
right is Mordecai the only one refusing to bow down? And the answer appears to be yes from our text. And the people who are supposed to bow down are the royal officials at the king's gate. We talked about the king's gate means the whole administrative bunch that work at that building or that place. So Mordecai is portrayed as the only one among that bunch who's refusing to honor Haman, and he's the only one who's singled out as Mordecai the Jew. So you get the idea that possibly the only Jewish person among the guys at the king's gate is Mordecai, and he's the only one that's refusing to obey the decree. And then, as we talked before, there's some uncertainty as to whether these people who are asking Mordecai why he's not bowing, are they put up to it by Haman, or are they also like, boy, we wish we had the scruples to do that, the guts to do that, and we don't know, so.
It just strikes me that only one person has
Yeah.
that courage.
Yeah. And why only Mordecai? And the backstory of the history of Mordecai's people, the tribe of Benjamin, the person Saul, and Haman's history, the tribe of the Amalekites, and the line of Agag have that history, and he knows it, and he's not forgotten, and that would be maybe one of the over-the-top reasons. It's also possible, it's been speculated, that Mordecai knew something of Haman, and that Haman was like the two guys who just tried to knock off the king, and that Mordecai's like, this guy's no good either, and was just being personally scrupulous. Did you have a question, Liz? Okay. Anyway, yeah. A lot of unexplained, this is one of the things about Esther. So many things aren't explicitly explained for us. Motivations, why things happened, and we're invited to do, and this has been a great conversation, everybody, invited to speculate a lot about what was known, what was thought, why were reactions happening the way they were. What we do know now is that, and we're assuming this again, his name doesn't appear in here, we're assuming that the Lord has honored Esther, Mordecai, and has heard and has vindicated and is interested in protecting his people, to whom he's made all these promises. The promises that God made to Abraham are not going to expire because of this self-absorbed knucklehead Haman who is causing all these problems. Overtime today, as it turns out, we will get into chapter 9 next week, maybe tie up a few loose ends with chapter 8. And next week will be part of, maybe all of chapter 9, and then eventually, I'd say we're probably 3 or 4 weeks away from being done with this. Chapter 10 is very short. Look at that. 3 verses in chapter 10. That won't be a whole week. But we will end with a Purim celebration. And Tammy has volunteered to help make the Haman's Pockets pastries for us to eat together on occasion. If you also want to make some pastries, we can have multiple pastry producers. That'd be fine. Just let me know, and we'll make that happen. Let's pray, and then we'll dismiss. Lord, we thank you that you're the God of justice, and we thank you that you honor humility and faithfulness and prayer, and we thank you for the way we see that in this story. I pray that you'll help us to wait confidently that the day of reckoning is coming, and that you will set all things right. And I pray that we'd also be able to view that day in the spirit of Malachi, that day will be a day of refiner's fire and launderer's soap, and we want to be ready. So prepare our hearts, Lord, prepare our lives, that we will be ready for the day of your coming again when you set all things right. And I pray, Lord, you would give us Esther's heart for people that are hurting, that maybe you're out of sight, out of mind, but are dealing with a reality that's not good right now. And we thank you that you have compassion on all of those kinds of folks, and compassion on us when we suffer, when things aren't right. And we thank you that you are the Lord who sees and who has great mercy and who rights all wrongs. We pray that you would send us out from this place today to be your witnesses and to bring glory and honor to you. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, going to end both of my videos here. And we'll see you next Wednesday for chapter 9.